Today, let's go back to ancient Rome and look at a time when murder was made legal. This led to thousands being killed, often by their own friends and family. This is Rome, but not the one you'd normally picture. In this Rome, murder is commonplace, with people being dragged out of their homes, seemingly at random, and executed in broad daylight. But these killings weren't random at all. These people were on the list. See, in the centre of Rome is a place called the Forum, where in normal times Romans would gather to share information, but now there's only one thing there: a board with a list of names, and if your name is on this list, then anyone can kill you and receive a generous payment of 2,500 drachma, which is about $100,000 in today's money. At the same time, anyone who tries to protect you will suffer the same fate, having their own name added as well. Neighbour turns against neighbour, friend against friend. Families are torn apart as they scramble to protect their loved ones or turn them in for money. Trust becomes a luxury no one can afford. And as people tried to make sense of the chaos, rumours spread. Rumours that people were being put on the list for saying the wrong thing, or being in the wrong family, or just being too wealthy. Nobody knew who was safe and who would be next. So, how did we get here? Well, let's rewind a few months and introduce Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, commonly known as just Sulla. He had just marched on Rome and declared himself dictator after beating his enemies in the First Civil War, which had lasted over 5 years. But for Sulla, the fight wasn't quite over. Even though he seemed to be in a position of power after winning on the battlefield, he actually had two big problems. Firstly, wars are expensive. So after 5 years of fighting, Sulla was broke. He had to find a way to fill up the coffers and stabilise his position, or he wouldn't remain dictator for very long. Secondly, there was also a decent chunk of surviving senators and politicians who still opposed the dictator and would do their best to see him removed from power, possibly even killed, as soon as the opportunity arose. So he came up with a plan to solve both problems with one solution. These were a series of murders that allowed Sulla to take care of his rivals in Rome whilst also making himself monstrously rich in the process. And the process was dead simple. Each day, he would publish a list of names with two instructions. 1, anybody who kills someone on this list gets a reward. And 2, anybody who tries to protect a named individual is added to the list. And that's all it took to cause absolute chaos. The most violent elements of society, who usually operated outside the law and in fear of justice, suddenly had the opportunity to work in the open and were given the coin instead of the lash. But although professional dealers of death may have had experience in their newly profitable line of work, they had one distinct disadvantage. Most of the names on the list would have been total strangers. They'd be one step behind their target's immediate social circle. See, if your name was put on Sulla's prescriptions, you definitely have these professional murderers coming for you, but first they need to find out where you lived, what you looked like, where you might be hiding, or where you'd run to. And that's a problem friends and family wouldn't have. So people would go to these murderers and tip off locations, descriptions, and addresses so that they could receive a share of the blood money. See, nothing was predictable at this time. Nobody knew who was next on the list. For some, it made sense to sell out an old friend if you could use the money to escape poverty or protect yourself if you were on the list tomorrow. It was a brutal climate of total paranoia, desperation, and greed. Friends stopped trusting each other, terrified that if they were on the list, their own would be the first to come for them, hoping to make themselves rich. Families were torn apart as parents, spouses, and siblings were forced to either protect loved ones on the list and risk being next, or hand them over to save themselves. Old rivals sought to settle feuds by getting their enemies on the list so that they could dispatch them without fear of consequence. It was bad. So bad, in fact, that Romans would later call this time Sulla's Reign of Terror. Now, of course, this all sounds super scary, but how many enemies can one man realistically have, and who was actually on the list? Well, depending on the source, approximately 5,000 people were killed during Sulla's proscriptions, so we can't nail it down to just one type of individual. The obvious thought would be that most of those killed would be senators, politicians, and military leaders, since they would be the only people who could realistically threaten Sulla's power. One such individual was a senator named Publius Laetorius, who was executed in 82 BC after his name appeared on the list. We don't have the details of his death, but we can guess that he was beheaded, since this was the popular way to kill people who were on the list. One individual, named Lollius, discovered that he was proscribed after seeing his name on the list and was immediately murdered on the spot once others saw his name. It's hard to imagine the fear and brutality, but here's the thing. We only have records of about 40 senators being listed during the proscriptions, and that's less than 2% of the total names that ended up on the list, so who were the other 98%? Well, here's where things get even darker. Most of Sulla's enemies began fleeing as soon as the proscriptions started. They saw the writing on the wall and realized it was a matter of time until they were next, so they left. Of course, not all were able to escape, but most of the intended targets managed to disappear before their names ever appeared on the list. So much so that over a third of the Roman Senate was gone. Now, this solved Sulla's first problem. His enemies in Rome were now far away or dead. But Sulla hadn't been able to generate the wealth he wanted this way. Most of those who fled took as much of their valuables with them as they possibly could, and realistically, you're not going to make the kind of money it takes to rule Rome just by seizing the property of a few dozen senators. So he did the next best thing and just started going after the wealthy. Anyone with a sizable fortune was now at risk of being proscribed, and the risk was very real. There's no way to dress this up as a brutal but necessary act to crush his enemies. This was a clear-cut, smash-and-grab operation, an indiscreet seizure of wealth to go along with his newfound power. And it worked. Sulla and an entire class of murderers and criminals became extremely rich as they gorged themselves on the property and assets of innocent people who'd done nothing wrong other than being wealthy. Earlier, we said only 2% of those killed during the proscriptions were senators. The majority of the other 98% was just random rich people that Sulla wanted dead for no other reason than to take their wealth. This continued for about a year, until in 81 BC, Sulla stopped adding names to the list. He'd achieved what he wanted, enormous wealth, and no one left to challenge him. And then, a year later, Sulla retired and just enjoyed his wealth, and died 2 years later in his villa in 78 BC. He'd probably enjoyed his retirement a little too well, since the cause of death was most likely liver failure caused by chronic alcohol abuse. And that was the end of Sulla, but it wasn't the end of the proscriptions. Within less than 40 years, they'd happen again, but this time they'd be even more cold and calculated. For all of this to make sense, we're going to first need to cover the Second Civil War so we can get into the Third Civil War, which kicked off the second proscriptions. I know that sounds like a lot, and that's because it is, but don't worry, we'll clear all this up in about 100 seconds. After Sulla's death, Rome returns to normal with the Senate leading politics again. One senator, Gaius Julius Caesar, starts getting a little bit too rich and powerful after conquering the province of Gaul, today known as France. The Senate doesn't like how rich and powerful Caesar is becoming, and Caesar is enjoying his wealth and power a little too much. Disagreements turn to arguments, and arguments turn to war when Caesar marched his army from Gaul down into Rome. The Senate flees to Greece, led by a Roman general named Pompey Magnus, and the Second Roman Civil War begins, lasting 4 years. Caesar wins that war at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey Magnus dies, the Senate returns to Rome, and Caesar makes himself dictator for life. That doesn't last very long though, because 2 senators, Brutus and Cassius, come up with a plot to kill him by stabbing him to death on the Senate floor, which was successful, and after being stabbed 23 times, Caesar was no more, and around 40 senators were involved in the murder plot. However, instead of being an end to tyranny, Caesar's death sparks another civil war between basically everyone in Rome. One side has Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's murderers, who wish to restore the Senate to power. On another, we have Marcus Tullius Cicero, backed by the Senate, who has no desire other than to see an end to tyranny and bloodshed. Then we have Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man and thinks he can probably be Caesar now that Caesar is dead. And lastly, we have Octavian, who actually is Caesar now that Caesar is dead, because Caesar named Octavian his sole heir, giving him the name of Caesar and his entire estate. Whew. And in one way or another, all these different factions end up fighting each other, which gets very confusing even to those fighting. Eventually, however, Octavian and Mark Antony realise that if they team up, they can basically call the shots in Rome and bring an end to the constant fighting, with them in control. Right, that's the end of the Second Civil War, and now we've got the side set up for the Third Civil War to get started. Let's go. So, Octavian, Mark Antony, and a third guy called Lepidus basically decide to share power over Rome and deal with Brutus, Cassius, Cicero, and the Senate as a team. This came to be known as the Second Triumvirate, a sharing of power between three men. The original triumvirate was actually between the aforementioned Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, and a guy called Crassus. Crassus died in Persia after having molten gold poured down his throat. That's a whole other story right there. Pompey Magnus died after being defeated by Caesar, and Caesar was, of course, stabbed to death by Cassius and Brutus in the Senate 23 times. The Second Triumvirate, though, is the one we're talking about now. Antony, Octavian, who now enjoys the name Caesar, and Lepidus, who really didn't do much. The Second Triumvirate now found themselves in the same position that Sulla was in less than 40 years ago. They had some control over Rome and held most of the power, but they had enemies who were keen to change that fact, and they had no money to deal with them. They dealt with this problem by, you guessed it, issuing another set of proscriptions. For Romans, Sulla's reign of terror was still in living memory, and the new proscriptions awoke the same horror and anguish that had been burnt into the minds of all but the youngest generation. But this time, things were different. Everyone in Rome knew that this Second Triumvirate would only last until the Civil War was over. Once Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had taken care of Brutus and Cassius, it was a matter of time until they started turning on each other. And so, each of these three men had an extensive list of names that they each brought to the table. These proscriptions were less random and not as much of an outright money grab, but rather personal, calculated, cold. You see, these killings were all about laying the groundwork for the next leader of Rome. What happened next was essentially a three-way chess game for the future of the Republic, with each triumvirate attempting to secure as many of their own as they could, while stripping the other two of theirs. Their family, friends, and closest allies were now reduced to just pieces on the board. The issue was, they were at a stalemate. What was a great list for Mark Antony was a terrible list for Octavian. What was a great list for Octavian was a terrible list for Lepidus, and so on. The trio couldn't reach a compromise. Gaining even an inch in one direction felt like losing a mile in another, and so a list they all agreed on felt unachievable. But having no list at all meant your enemies remained alive, both present and future threats being left undealt with. The way they resolved this situation was a Pyrrhic victory, to say the least. One example of these compromises is the story of Cicero. Cicero was a prominent and respected politician at the time who had more or less kept his hands clean throughout the civil wars and was doing his best to avert tyranny and disaster. Cicero immediately saw Mark Antony for the power-hungry tyrant he was, and didn't hesitate to vocalize this fact, writing a total of 14 speeches against Mark Antony that came to be known as the Philippics. In these speeches, he rails against Antony, calling him a drunk, a gambler, a party animal who lacks any self-control or morality, and was outright useless in the Senate. He describes Antony as the voice of the drunken people, irresponsible, rash, and impulsive. This, of course, gets right under Antony's skin, and so Cicero had secured the leading spot on Antony's list. Unfortunately for Antony, though, Cicero was a father figure to Octavian, having educated and guided him in the world of politics. Antony couldn't wait to get rid of him. Octavian wanted nothing but to protect him. Cicero's case is one of the main examples of this stalemate, and what happens next is a show of just how horrific things got. The Second Triumvirate began to barter and trade names on the list. I'll give you my mentor in exchange for your right-hand man. These men were giving up family members, old friends, trusted colleagues, literally trading the lives of their brethren just to inch that much closer to power. The stakes cannot be overstated. These men were laying the groundworks for their future attempts at control of the Republic, and they're willing to trade allies for ambition. Whoever wins next is as good as emperor, and so everyone's an option. Cicero was no exception. Octavian agreed to trade him like you'd trade baseball cards on the playground. Octavian would give up Cicero, but only if Antony gave up his uncle and Lepidus gave up his brother, and they all agreed. And so, on December 7th, 43 BC, the great statesman Cicero was murdered by unnamed assassins, his hands nailed to the Senate door as retaliation for his many slights against Antony. Gruesome as that was, Cicero was just one of 2,000 names on the list. Like before, many were targeted simply because of their wealth, but most were political. Brutus and Cassius were also added to the list, but because they weren't in Rome at the time, they weren't murdered by Roman citizens, although later died at the Battle of Philippi. Once Brutus and Cassius died, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus were now left unchallenged. The big difference with the second round of proscriptions, though, was the pay. In modern money, each name on the list was worth around $100,000 dead. If you could take care of just 10 names on that list of 2,000, you'd be a millionaire. So the incentive to perform the murders was enormous, and this caused a total wildfire in Roman society, because once again, the worst elements of Rome were becoming extraordinarily wealthy by committing some of the worst crimes possible. The Roman streets were full of corpses with their heads removed so that they could be identified and paid for the gruesome task. We have historical records saying that dogs and birds feasted on the remains. Chaos. Some people did anything they could to protect those listed. There are 2 accounts of slaves volunteering to change clothes with their prescribed masters. The slaves would then go about their day pretending to be the individual on the list until they were slain, at which time the master would take the opportunity to slip away. Another chilling account shows a boy whose father found himself on the list. The boy hid his father so well that he couldn't be found, and when the killers ran out of patience, they began torturing the boy for information. The boy didn't say anything, but the father, being so distraught from hearing the sounds of torture, revealed himself to the killers in exchange for his son's safety. It's chilling stuff, and all this was just for money. And it gets worse. What made it even more chaotic and violent was the sheer confusion at the time. See, Octavian, Lepidus, and Antony couldn't even agree on when to punish and when to reward, let alone who to kill. The triumvirs were even adding names to the list behind each other's backs, which meant people would bring kills to the wrong triumvir, who'd be horrified to see the heads of their allies and punish the killer for what they'd done when the killer was expecting a reward. In other times, people would hide and protect those on the list, and they'd be made a public example of by being added to the list themselves. Or sometimes they were called heroes and given official pardons. And now nobody knew for sure what the rules were, and who was and wasn't safe, and what did and didn't get you punished or rewarded. Chaos. One thing we've not spoken much of, however, and it is a brighter note here, is women. See, unlike a lot of European history, Roman women actually enjoyed quite a decent level of personal, financial, and political freedom. And even though women never featured on the list of those prescribed, their husbands often did. There are a lot of accounts of people being listed and then surviving because of the diligence, resourcefulness, and risk that Roman women were willing to take in order to protect their husbands, fathers, and sons. One senator, named Quintus, survived the proscription and wrote that it was only through his wife Toria that he survived. He writes that only through her intelligence and care was he able to stay alive, hide, escape, and survive life outside of Rome, by using his wife's network of friends and allies to remain protected as he fled Rome. She even made the effort to take revenge against those who came to kill him. Quintus's eulogy at her funeral is quoted as saying, "You provided abundantly for my needs during my flight, and gave me the means for a dignified manner of living. When you took all the golden jewelry from your body and gave it to me, and over again enriched me in my absence with money, servants, and provisions, and in great ingenuity deceived the guards posted by our adversaries." Unlike Quintus, though, most did not have people they could completely rely on during the proscriptions. At least 2,000 people found themselves being proscribed, with few surviving more than a few days after being listed. However, after a year, Rome came out of the frying pan and into the fire. The Proscriptions ended when the Second Triumvirate faced off against Cassius and Brutus, as we mentioned before, and finished them off at the Battle of Philippi. This was a breath of relief to the average Roman. The Third Civil War was now over. Cassius and Brutus had been killed, and Rome looked like it could once again finally be at peace. The Proscriptions had totally restructured Roman political life, and now few were willing or able to speak out or resist Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. It looked like 41 BC, exactly 40 years after Sulla had retired, could finally be the beginning of peace in Rome. That peace, however, was short-lived when Antony and Octavian started fighting amongst each other, which is a story for another time, but Octavian defeated Antony in 31 BC and brought a close to the civil war in Rome, and saw Rome transformed from a republic led by a senate of around 300 men to an empire ruled by one man only, Octavian, also known as Augustus Caesar. Rome's change from republic to empire also brought with it a change from chaos to order, as Rome entered the Pax Romana, a time of peace after 4 back-to-back civil wars. But the Proscriptions remained burned into the Roman memory as the most chaotic, ruthless, and brutal time to have ever been witnessed. But what do you guys think? Were they a brutal but necessary means to stabilize politics, or a simple way to kill your enemies and take all their money? Let us know in the comments, and until next time, stay safe and don't get yourself on anyone's list.